On the brink of a war, two men prepared for a duel. One was Goliath, described in the Bible as a giant over 9 feet tall. The other was a young Israelite shepherd boy called David. It's one of the most famous and best-loved stories in the Bible. But behind the heroic legend lies a tale of relentless ambition, callous murder, conquests on the battlefield, and also in the bedroom. David's mission would ultimately unite a people, but only after it tore a country wide apart. The legendary duel between David and Goliath took place about 1015 BC, when the Israelites were embroiled in a war against their ancestral enemy, the Philistines. More than 200 years had elapsed since the great military commander Moses first led the 12 Israelite tribes out of Egypt in what is known as the Exodus. His successor, Joshua, continued the military campaign and successfully invaded the promised land of Canaan. At this point, after 2 centuries and thousands of lives lost in battle, the Israelites no longer called this territory Canaan, but their homeland, Israel. The tribes had developed into one of the most powerful military forces in the area and were united for the first time under a king named Saul. Saul's long war against the Philistines had kept the kingdom in a perpetual state of battle readiness and tension. On that fateful day in the valley of Elah, only one man would die, but it would be an historic death of huge significance.
The armies faced one another for several days until, as often happened in the ancient world, which believed that it was God that decided battles, that each side would choose a champion. And the champions would meet, and whoever won would convey victory to their side. Everyone knows the story of David and Goliath, where David ventures onto the plain, fires a sling at Goliath, strikes him between the eyes, and Goliath is killed. And then David goes over, takes his sword, and chops off Goliath's head.
David's slaying of Goliath was a turning point in the war against the Philistines. But more importantly, it launched the young shepherd boy on a career of intrigue, deception, and paranoia, which would ultimately propel him to the throne of Israel.
It's one of the more interesting aspects of the Bible, that David is held in such high regard as the father of Israel and the king of Israel. But when you really look at his career, what he really is a kind of bloodthirsty opportunist. More than a mythical figure, more than a person of great valor, he more resembles a mafia don, a very narrow, self-interested man who clearly knew what he wanted and was prepared to do anything to get it, to include the betrayal and killing of his own people.
The important thing about the incident of David and Goliath is not military, it's political and social. What happens because of the slaying of Goliath is this young man comes to the attention of the great warrior king Saul.
David instantly became a hero. He gained a position as King Saul's personal weapons bearer. This gave the boy the opportunity to hone his skills as a warrior. But Saul's initial feelings of admiration and affection soon darkened into suspicion and jealousy.
Even from the beginning, you get the sense that this is going to lead to disaster. On the way back from the first battle after David slew Goliath, there is dancing in the streets and women singing, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s." Well, Saul has just been through 20 years of brutal war, while David has thrown a single stone. So perhaps we can forgive Saul for being a tad bit jealous.
What Saul was concerned about, and rightly so, having spent all his years creating at least a modicum of a kingdom of Israel with him as a king, he's interested in passing that on to his son. And he's a little bit concerned that David has picked up some allies at court, because David turns out to be a good soldier.
The king was also suspicious of David's close friendship with his son, Jonathan. The two men formed a strong brotherly bond on and off the battlefield.
Saul now is becoming quite alarmed that David is positioning himself to be the heir of the throne, or failing that, to control Jonathan. And this becomes the basis for the break with David.
To escape Saul, David retreated to his home tribe of Judah that inhabited a region in southern Israel. But even there, he was hunted down by Saul's assassins. So David fled and allied himself with Israel's bitter enemy, the Philistines.
It was at this time that David begins to assemble a cadre of what the Bible calls desperate men. They are really outlaws. They're soldiers of fortune, and they place themselves on the side of the Philistines. So now David is not only an outlaw, but in a very real sense, he's become a traitor to his own people.
But before the Philistines would accept David, they had to be persuaded that he wasn't a spy.
The first thing the Philistine prince is going to do, he's going to test David's loyalty. And how do you test an Israelite's loyalty? I've got to believe that he's going to order David to raid Israelite settlements.
The Philistine prince controlled the area called Gath, situated on the border of David's tribal lands of Judah.
Easy pickings against Israelite villages. And so he sends David against the Israelite villages, and David follows orders. David becomes a raider of the border villages between Philistia and the Israelite kingdoms, and gathers up the booty and delivers it to the Philistine prince.
While David and his men were camped near Hebron, the Bible describes the day when the Philistine army made a daring raid on the Israelites at Mount Gilboa. Saul and Jonathan held the high ground. It seemed they would be able to repel the Philistine attack. But the Philistines managed to encircle the Israelites and bombard them with missiles. Saul and Jonathan were doomed.
Saul is hit several times. He turns to his sword bearer and says, "Do not leave me to the uncircumcised. They'll torture me and make sport of me." But the sword bearer can't bring himself to kill his king.
Not wishing to be captured, Saul took his own life. The Philistines beheaded King Saul and hung his body from the city walls.
From the Philistine position, nothing could have been better. The Israelite monarch is gone. Israel is in defeat. The Philistines now control everything.
But the Philistines had a problem. One heir to Saul's kingdom was still alive, his son, Ishbaal, and neither he nor his chief military commander, Abner, was prepared to admit defeat.
Ishbal and Abner move across the Jordan River, but their government is too small and remote to be of major concern. So the Philistines simply ignore it. However, they do want a way to control the Israelite population. Their answer? Make David king.
A messenger arrived to inform David of Saul's death. He brought with him the monarch's crown.
The last people to have Saul's headpiece, and his head, quite frankly, were the Philistines. Now suddenly it ends up in the hands of David. Makes one think that the Philistines have plans for David.
With the endorsement of the Philistines, David became king of the tribe of Judah. But David wanted more than that. He wasn't interested in merely governing one tribe as a puppet of the Philistines. He intended to be king of all Israel.
He brings in muscle from his days as an outlaw, men who were ruthless, experienced killers, and completely loyal to David.
Well, he takes those, what's called the Gegud, which are those 600 outlaws that he had fought with, and he establishes them in all the villages and towns of Judah. And the reason for this is not only to extend his political control, but when he has to raise a militia force from those Israelite territories, these men can enforce his will.
David appointed his nephew, Joab, as his chief military commander, and sent him to lead a civil war against Ishbal's growing army. David knew that to become the uncontested king of Israel, he needed to wipe out Saul's bloodline completely.
The Israelites believed that Saul was anointed by God, so any blood relative of Saul is automatically more legitimate than David can ever be. That is, as long as they're alive.
Over the following 2 years, David's forces, led by Joab, clashed again and again with Ishbal's troops. With every slash of his blade, David moved closer to his ultimate goal, to take the crown of Israel. The year was 1004 BC. 10 years after David slew Goliath, he embarked on a bloody civil war to establish himself as king of all Israel. David's nephew, Joab, commanded the army against Ishbal, the son of Saul, the Israelite king beheaded by the Philistines.
The Bible is silent about the number of battles and how many people were killed, but it's very clear about the fact that Ishbal's army was getting the worst of it.
The most common weapon of the day was the straight sword, used to thrust, slash, and hack at the enemy. The 6-foot wooden spear, tipped with iron, was used to impale unfortunate opponents. Ultimately, David's forces prevailed, but the cycle of killing didn't end.
And this is where David, the Mafia Don, really starts to show his colors. Like a scene right out of The Godfather, David becomes king and whacks all of his enemies.
One of the first to die was Abner, Ishbal's field commander. He had seen the writing on the wall and tried to defect to David's side, but Joab considered him a threat.
Joab is the consigliere. Joab is the trigger man, and he did it because it was the right thing to do, at least if you're talking strategic politics.
Then, suddenly, one night, Ishbal was murdered while he slept. When the assassins presented David with Ishbal's head, the king put them to death.
Now, looked at from a kind of Sicilian perspective, if one orders the assassination of another person, the best way to prove you weren't involved is to kill the assassins you sent to kill him.
And he killed them as soon as they walked in the door. David makes this whole to-do about how horrible it was that Ishbal was killed. But of course, who is the one that benefited most from Ishbal's death? David. The Bible never blames David for his death. But logically, who else could have done it?
In one final grisly act, designed to secure his position as the ruler of Israel, David ordered the execution of the last remaining heirs to the throne, Saul's 7 young grandsons.
David has them crucified and staked out into the sun, where they all die. With that act, there are no more legitimate claimants to the throne.
David was never blamed for any of the deaths. His hold on the throne of Israel was secure, but his ambitions had grown. He wanted to expand Israel into an empire.
David rises to power because he's really the toughest guy on the block. He's the most ambitious guy on the block. He's the man with almost no limits in what he'll do to further his own interest. And so it's a bloody rise to power. And then what happens is it becomes a bloody regime to stay in power.
David's first priority was to rid himself of all obligations. He turned on the Philistines to put him in power. In a sustained series of battles, he beat them into submission. After being comprehensively defeated, the Philistine soldiers were coerced into fighting for David's army. They also had to supply him with their most valuable weapon, the war chariot. The Philistine chariot of the time was drawn by 2 horses and usually carried 2 men, the driver and the archer. The archer was highly skilled. He fired arrows while bouncing along on rough ground at speeds of perhaps 10 miles an hour. The wooden platform was fashioned in a D shape, with the axle positioned in the middle of the carrying platform, ensuring stability and giving the chariot increased strength. Commanding an army that had grown to approximately 10,000 soldiers, David captured the city of Jerusalem, which he established as Israel's first capital.
He looks around, and what does he see? What do any king see when they're in charge? Threats. And he looks to the east, and there on its border, on what today we would call the modern Jordanian River or Jordan Valley, there are 3 states that offer strategic and economic threats.
These were Ammon, Moab, and Edom, which was first on David's hit list.
The real reason he wants that is economic. There are large copper and iron mines in Edom, and Edom sits right across what we call the King's Highway.
The King's Highway connected Syria with Egypt. David wanted free access to this important trade route, so he moved to take Edom by force.
David moves very quickly to bring Edom within the Israelite orb, and does so with incredible brutality.
David orders the complete extermination of the Edomite male population. The children and women are sold into slavery. Their government is dismantled. And Edom essentially ceases to exist and is annexed by Israel.
The carnage at Edom carried a potent message to any who might be foolish enough to consider retaliation. But David's orgy of bloodletting had only just begun. Next was Moab.
Having achieved the conquest of Edom, destroyed its population, but gathered all its economic resources, and now having cut the King's Highway, the state that bordered up against Edom, the state of Moab, now appears to be a threat to containing those, to preserving those resources. It's an old story in history where something that was a buffer state at one point suddenly becomes a threat and has to be neutralized. It's kind of the history's first domino theory.
David knew Moab wasn't really a threat to Israel because it was on the far side of the Dead Sea. But he didn't intend to take any chances, and again he proved himself a merciless conqueror.
David sends his army against Moab and makes very quick work of them. Sheer numbers would have carried the day, but here we find an interesting description of how he actually dealt with them.
And he smote Moab, and measured them with the line, making them to lie down on the ground.
And what the Bible tells us is that the captives of all military age were laid out in 3 lines, while the troops went among 2 of the lines and put them all to the mouth of the sword, which means essentially beheading them.
For a second time, David had laid waste to one of the neighboring states, leaving it powerless to oppose him. But he was about to collide with Israel's most powerful competitor in the region. More blood was about to spill onto the Holy Land. It was about 1000 BC, and King David's Israelite army was on the offensive. It had already destroyed both the tribes of Edom and Moab. Then David led almost 10,000 troops north.
Having conquered both Edom and Moab, David naturally turns his eyes to the remaining state that is a competitor for Israeli interests in the Jordan Valley, and that is the Ammonites, whose capital is at Rabbah, which is modern Ammon.
Ammon was the last but most important of the 3 eastern border states David sought to subdue. It was Israel's chief competitor for influence in the region.
In order to understand what happened at Rabbah, I have to understand the political context, and that is that the Ammonites were not stupid. They could clearly see the expansion of Israelite interests into the valley.
There were some negotiations between David and Haman, the king of Ammon, until David claimed some kind of diplomatic insult. At which point, the Ammonites got the message and began to look around for allies.
They found an ally to the north in the land of Aram, in what is present-day Syria. It was a new group that had risen to power under a ruler called Hadadezer, who had significant ambitions of his own.
Hadadezer's no fool. He's looking for any pretext to extend his main influence south into Israel and to stop David's advance. This is just the perfect pretext.
When David received intelligence that the Ammonites had appealed to Hadadezer for aid, he ordered Joab to take his army to attack Rabbah.
And very quickly he assembles the entire army and puts his consigliere, Joab, in charge and tells him quickly to march on the capital of Rabbah and destroy it and defeat the Ammonites.
Joab and the Israelites crossed the river Jordan without incident. With no hostile troops in sight, they marched directly across the plain to Rabbah.
What happens is the Ammonite army comes out of its city and deploys in front of the city with its infantry offering battle.
Joab lined up his men opposite the Ammonites. But as the Israelites approached the walls of Rabbah, 20,000 Arameans attacked them from the rear.
What had happened was the Ammonites formed up, essentially as bait to a trap.
The Israelites were caught between a rock and a hard place. To counter the Aramean attack, Joab did something unorthodox. He split his army in two.
So Joab turns to his brother, who's second in command, and says, "You take one group and attack the walls. I'll take the other and deal with the chariot."
Remember that David had at his disposal a number of vassals of Canaanite and Philistine states whose specialty was heavy infantry and chariot warfare.
Joab instructed his Canaanite and Philistine charioteers to turn around and charge the Arameans who were thundering across the plain towards them.
What follows is a swirling mass of chariots vying for position as the opposing infantries fight it out in bloody hand-to-hand combat.
So this large chariot battle is fought on the open plain, in which the Arameans get the worst of and begin to flee.
Seeing the chariots on the run, Joab turned his infantry loose.
The Ammonite infantry, now mixing it up with the Israelite infantry in front of the city, lose their spirit, and they begin to withdraw back into the city. And so the battle is essentially a draw.
Joab's success in deploying a divided force is perceived as a remarkable feat to this day. Today's military colleges always teach commanders to keep their forces united.
But it sure must have put the fear of the Lord in Joab, because he made no further movement to attacking the capital of Rabbah. He immediately grabbed the infantry, grabbed what chariots he had, and basically withdrew quickly back across the Jordan and back to Jerusalem, saying that this has not been a great day.
After the battle, the Arameans retreated north into what is now southern Syria. David wasted no time. The Bible states that he told all Israel to assemble.
And when you hear that phrase, all Israel, what you mean is the entire militia army, probably 20 to 25,000 strong.
David personally led the Israelites northwards, carefully bypassing the city of Rabbah and the Ammonite army.
He's a smart tactician, a little bit smarter than Joab. He does not cross the Jordan Valley where Joab crossed. What he does instead is he moves on the Israelite side along the watercourse of the Jordan Valley, using it to protect his flank.
The Israelites collided with the Arameans somewhere south of Succoth. The engagement became known as the Battle of Helam.
What we have to imagine in the battle at Helam was that it was a combined infantry and chariot battle.
He was truly living up to his reputation for brutality. His victims at the Battle of Helam, the Arameans, were being slaughtered without mercy.
There's no great detail in the Bible except to say that a swirling battle was fought and many of the Arameans were killed. The proof of this is that the commander of the Arameans was killed. Now that tends to suggest that they were completely overwhelmed.
When you kill the commander of an ancient army, who's chariot-borne, by the way, which means I can actually get out of here very quickly if I have to, you've done a very good day's work.
Bruised and humiliated by the Israelites for a second time, the Arameans again retreated northwards.
David now understands that I didn't come this far to win a single battle. We might as well deal with it while we have the troops in the field, and he continues to move north.
News of the Aramean defeat at Helam spread quickly through the region. Revolts erupted throughout the states that the Aramean king Hadadezer had already conquered.
This creates a real problem for the Armenian king Hadadezer, because he can't launch a concerted attack against David until he puts down these revolts. So he has to deal with both at once.
Hadadezer assigned a force to hold off David and the Israelites, while he himself mounted a campaign to put down the rebellions.
At this point, David continues his advance north and slams right into Hadadezer's rear guard.
For the third time in 6 months, the Israelites confronted the Arameans.
What happens is that David catches up with Hadadezer's main army. He turns, and a great battle occurs in which many thousands were slain, the Bible says.
And David smote Hadadezer, king of Zobah, by Hamath, as he went to establish his dominion at the river Euphrates. David and the Israelites caught the Arameans on the run and slaughtered a great many of them. Hadadezer's empire was destroyed. Henceforth, unopposed from the north, David claimed the Aramean vassal states in the name of Israel.
So now, with the addition of the Aramean kingdom, David controls a very large area. This is what comes to define what is called the Empire of Israel.
The new Israelite Empire now stretched from the river Euphrates in the north to the Egyptian border in Sinai to the south, and from the Mediterranean Sea to the west to the Jordanian mountains in the east. But one last foe remained to be subjugated before David could rest: the Ammonites at Rabbah.
Now, of course, they are deprived of their Aramean armies. And so David turns his attention to bringing Ammon into the Israelite orbit.
But at the same time, the Bible describes David being distracted from the work of conquest by a beautiful woman he observed from his palace.
This seems to be the time when David is smitten by this beautiful girl named Bathsheba. And so instead of taking the army himself into battle, some analysts suspect what kept David in Jerusalem was his lust for Bathsheba. Instead, he turns to his consigliere, Joab, and says, take the army and go among the Ammonites and defeat them.
David ordered Bathsheba to be brought to him. But she was a married woman. Her husband, Uriah the Hittite, was a soldier serving under Joab in the army.
Total scandal. David is the stuff of legend. He's thought of as a great warrior and a great unifier. He's the founder of the first Israelite nation state, the darling of the Bible. But much has been said of his flaws, especially with women.
And so, while David is having his way with Bathsheba, Joab assembles the Israelite armies in two bodies.
One was the militia stationed at Succoth in the Jordan River Valley. The other was the elite force made up mainly of professional infantrymen and charioteers. They marched to Rabbah and laid siege to the city.
When you talk about a siege, in this time among the Israelites, is they have no equipment. They take cities the way they normally take cities, which is by storm. The problem with that, with regard to Rabbah, is in order to do that, you need a large numerical advantage. And most of the militia troops are at Sukkoth.
From the ramparts of Rabbah, the Ammonite archers were able to pick off the Israelite infantry with ease. But the blood spilled there was not the first thing on David's mind.
David is back in Jerusalem, apparently, having a good time with Bathsheba, and he gets a message from Joab, his commander. He said, things are pretty tough here. He said, you know, every time we venture near the walls, we lose men. We lost 18 men just yesterday, in which case David replies, well, then don't go near the walls. Well, here is when the problem begins to develop, is that apparently Bathsheba turns up pregnant.
And the problem with this is that she is married to Uriah the Hittite. So this creates a bit of a problem. Uriah is stationed with the army at Rabbah, fighting for David.
David summoned Uriah back to Jerusalem.
So Uriah, being a good soldier that he is, reports back to Jerusalem. And David says to him, look, you've been a good soldier, you're on the front line, you deserve a rest. Right? Go back to your wife, go rest a little before you go back to battle.
Think about this for a minute. There's only one reason David would send Uriah home to Bathsheba, so they can have sex. It looks like David is trying to hide the paternity of Bathsheba's unborn child.
Well, the next day, after David told him to go to his wife, David walks out of his bedroom door and stumbles over Uriah the Hittite, who was falling asleep outside the door. And one can imagine what the conversation was like when the king of Israel says to this lowly soldier, what are you doing here? I told you to go home to eat and be with your wife. And he said, Sire, how can I do that? When my colleagues and fellow soldiers are in danger at the front lines, I cannot go with my wife. It would be wrong.
Uriah keeps to the Israelite soldiers' code of honor. None shall sleep with their wives when at war. All for one, one for all, so to speak. But in refusing David's command to sleep with his wife, he seals his fate with David.
The Bible says David wrote a note for Joab and sent it to the front line with Uriah. And he wrote in the letter, saying, Set ye Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die. A loyal soldier to the end, Uriah followed his commander's orders to the letter. Uriah the Hittite was a valiant soldier in the Israelite army, but the great King David had decided he should die.
David essentially, having failed to camouflage the pregnancy of Bathsheba, simply decides to have her husband killed in an almost mafia-like style. And who in command of this, of course, is his consigliere, which is Joab.
Joab sent Uriah into the thick of close combat, where survival was extremely improbable. It seemed David would stop at nothing to possess Bathsheba.
In Jerusalem, Bathsheba hears that Uriah has been killed in action. She goes into mourning, standard cultural practice. As soon as her period of mourning is over, King David calls her to become his wife.
But David's actions didn't pass unnoticed. The Bible says that the baby died as punishment for his sin.
Uriah's dead. David has taken Bathsheba as his wife. This is all pretty heavy Old Testament scandal. But militarily, there's still a battle being waged at Rabbah.
The Israelites are still stuck outside the walls of Rabbah. And so finally, David sends a message to Joab, renew the attack, carry the day.
Joab finally broke through the Ammonite defenses.
And then Joab, he sends a message back to David and says, in essence, look, this is going well, but you better come out here because your absence is noted, and what people are going to say is they're going to give me credit for this victory. Well, David's no fool. He understands that to be king means that you have to do kingly things. And so what he does is he marches up to Sukkoth, joins with the rest of the army, and then marches on Rabbah, and then now with even more troops, the city is taken by storm.
As in all his previous triumphs, David made a point of eliminating any possibility of the vanquished tribe rising up against him. So the slaughter continued.
The Bible says he set the people to the mold, which is essentially what Pharaoh had done to the Israelites. He set them to construction work.
One of their first tasks was to tear down their own city walls.
Which is a very common thing to do in those days. Once you took the city, you destroyed its defenses so it couldn't resist you anymore.
David's goals had all been accomplished. The Israelite Empire was born.
So it's a bloody rise to power. And then what happens is it becomes a bloody regime to stay in power. It becomes so bad that there are even revolts against David by his own people.
And even by his own son.
Talk about a dysfunctional family. David is still married to Bathsheba, right? The first baby dies. Well, David's got other wives and concubines, and eventually has many more children, one of whom is Absalom. Well, it turns out Absalom will kill his older brother because the older brother rapes their half-sister. All right, now, this will start a rift between David and Absalom.
The rift deepened into rebellion. Two Israelite forces clashed in what is known as the Battle in the Wood of Ephraim. Absalom was determined to overthrow David and become king. But in the end, his army was comprehensively routed.
The story goes that Absalom had this beautiful long hair, and during the battle he gets it caught on the branches of a tree in the wood of Ephraim.
Now, exactly what happened, we don't know. But one thing is certain, he doesn't make it out of that forest alive.
David had issued orders that Absalom's life should be spared. But one man disobeyed that order, Joab.
True conciliary, if that's what we could call him. Joab eliminates David's biggest threat. Politically, he did the right thing.
David ruled the Israelite Empire for a further 23 years. The Bible states that he died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 110. But even after his death, murder and intrigue continued to haunt the house of David. His other son by Bathsheba, Solomon, became the next king. One of his first acts was to murder Joab.
This wasn't done for any kind of retribution. It most likely was to secure his own personal power. Solomon might have seen Joab as a threat, and like his father before him, he eliminated that threat.
David is the most popular figure in the Bible. Children are named after him. He's seen as a hero, as the person who founded the Israelite Empire, the nation state. So he is a kind of almost mythical figure. But when you look at him in reality, he turns out to be all too human. From my perspective, even more fascinating that people still hold him up as a kind of mythical person to emulate, because he had a lot of bad habits.
David has been admired down the ages for uniting the tribes of Israel and establishing the Israelite Empire. Like most conquerors, he was also ambitious, treacherous, and utterly lacking in pity for those he defeated. The Bible says that toward the end of his life, he was always cold, no longer able to feel warmth. Perhaps, like his amazing God-given accomplishments, this too was divine will.